We are defined by the context in which we live, what, in fictional terms, we call our setting. Place, time, climate, values, and traditions all coalesce to form the circumstances necessary to shape us. If setting's defining influence is true of real people, it's doubly true for fictional characters. Just as dialogue must be purposeful and concise, so too must a story's setting be intentional and relevant. So how do we determine what is the best setting for our story? Let's take a closer look at what opportunities setting affords and techniques to take advantage of those opportunities. Burroway begins by examining how fictional setting creates atmosphere through three primary components: place, time, and mood. The writer's tone is the element that binds and colors all three of these components at once. This is because each component carries with it certain connotations. If the story's place is set in the English countryside, this might create a serene, earthy, and fantastical tone. A story set during the Roaring Twenties might add a tone of wild, debaucherous romance. However, the story's overall mood would be determined by the connotations of the language used to describe these components. Depending on the writer's narrative tone, the piece could have a mysterious and sinister atmosphere, or an atmosphere rife with magic and romantic possibility. Add to the period and place the more specific categorical factors such as weather and the time of day, and we see that a single setting can potentially convey several very different atmospheres. We want to calibrate them all precisely to fit our intended atmosphere for the setting. Once the atmosphere is established, we want to make sure the setting counterpoints the character. One way to do that is by creating disharmony between character and setting. While we often understand how to create conflict at the interpersonal level and interpersonal level, we often forget extrapersonal conflict between character and setting. Let's take our example setting from earlier. Our story takes place at an isolated, rundown Victorian mansion located in the English countryside. It's midnight and there's a thunderstorm raging. Now, what if we added to that picture an attractive young woman? She pulls up to the mansion in an expensive car and gets out wearing the latest Parisian fashion despite the weather. Even without knowing her reason for being there, the disharmony between character and setting creates an implicit conflict. Say that we learn from her thoughts that she loves Gothic architecture because it's featured in her favorite books. Even if she can't see the disharmony between her naive perception and grim reality, we readers do. And we can already speculate about where things are headed and how they might turn out. All this from only a brief description of the setting and some cursory characterization of our protagonist. While Burroway says symbolic place can lend dimensionality to a story, she discusses it only briefly because it is easily botched. The key to creating a symbolic place is to imbue the location with symbolism subtly and unobtrusively. An example of the story that uses ham-fisted symbolic place would be James Cameron's Avatar. The planet Pandora is named after Pandora's box, which, when opened, brought sickness, pain, and death into the world. Likewise, when humans discovered the planet Pandora, they became harbingers of sickness, pain, and death for the natives. The problem with such obvious symbolism is it draws so much attention to itself that we are pulled out of the story to contemplate its inclusion. The film In Bruges is a good example of how to use symbolic place subtly. Its real-world setting, Bruges, becomes associated with purgatory via subtle allusions throughout the film. In fact, though the film seems to be a work of pure realism at first, after multiple viewings, its allegorical potential comes into focus. We realize Bruges symbolizes the protagonist's internal moral struggle. It could even be literally occurring in purgatory itself. Before going on to explore all the different techniques of narrative time, Burroway lays out how readers interact with literature in real time and how time functions within literature. When we view a sculpture, the amount of time we choose to look at it is up to us. We can look at the David from the moment we enter the gallery until the gallery closes, whereas temporally based art, such as film, has a fixed duration. Literature doesn't fit neatly within either of these two categories. As with viewing a sculpture, for the most part we can choose when we read a book and for how long. However, though a book may take 10 hours to read, those 10 hours might be spaced out between days or months depending on how often we read and how quickly. But how does time function within a fictional setting itself? A story that takes 20 minutes to read could have a content time of only a few seconds. For instance, Tobias Wolff's story, Bullet in the Brain, has the protagonist's life flash before his eyes as a bullet passes through his skull. By contrast, Ken Liu's story, The Paper Menagerie, also takes about 20 minutes to read, but covers a content time of 30 years. With these foundational elements of fiction, Fictional Time in Mind will examine some of the narrative techniques that make it possible to manipulate time within fictional settings. There are two main ways of rendering fictional time. The first is summary, which covers a relatively long period of time in a relatively short space on the page. The second way is scene, which deals at length with a relatively short period of time. Summary's purpose is to convey info, provide exposition, illuminate character motive, adjust the pace, and transition between scenes. Scene, however, renders a story's key turning points beat for beat, allowing readers to be in the moment, experiencing it with all five senses. Broadway describes summary as the mortar which holds a building together, and scene as the bricks that make up the building. We want to engage readers emotionally, so it behooves us to write as much of our story in scene as possible. Few things are more compelling than watching a moment of discovery, decision, or action that forever changes the character's life firsthand. Thus, while we can render an entire story in scene, summarizing it is unlikely to hold attention because key moments would go undramatized. Burroway also identifies two subtypes of summary, circumstantial and sequential. Circumstantial summary conveys how things were generally during an extended period. It tracks repeated events, whereas sequential summary compresses a sequence of causally related events. Burroway suggests that to determine when to use each of these techniques in our story, we want to observe how our own mind delineates and portrays memories. In the end, she says, both kinds of summary exist to contextualize key turning points for maximum impact, which are rendered in scene. So summary precedes and follows a scene, which dramatizes a turning point. The two alternate until the story ends. Sometimes we need to transition between scenes, but what happens between scenes is irrelevant to the story. So we cut to a new time, place, or perspective. While film achieves this transition through cuts, in fiction we do this through whitespace on the page. It sounds counterintuitive, but when using whitespace, we ought to avoid transitional language, such as, "It wasn't long before." Though such transitions are meant to orient readers, they are extraneous and often can't come across as the writer doubting the reader's intelligence. So while 3 hours later might work for SpongeBob, it's an insulting way to transition in fiction. Burroway mentions a second way to transition instead of whitespace, which she calls montage. Montage is a kind of hybrid between summary and cut to. Although it doesn't summarize specific circumstances or a sequence of events, it does create a panoramic sweep of movement through time and space using quick impressionistic details. For example, a whitespace transition might read, "John laid out his clothes for the trip, checking and double-checking he had all his necessities." Whitespace. Florida turned out to be colder than he imagined. Whereas a montage transition might read, "Stacks of perfectly folded summer tees and shorts, revolving the pillow to find that elusive cold spot, rushing to arrive on time only for delayed, boarding, turbulence, drunk, falling off the plane, a cold, devastating breeze." Which technique you choose, whitespace or montage, all depends on the effect you wish to create. While summary and whitespace allow us to skip ahead in a story, flashback allows us to go back in time to contextualize the present scene. However, too often, writers flashback every chance they get rather than finding ways to subtly convey the same information through characterization and dialogue. Just as we mentioned preferring subtlety in symbolic place and whitespace transitions, a light touch is all that's needed when writing flashbacks. There's no need to beat readers over the head with "Dave thought back." Instead, it's best to use a simple trigger or mnemonic in the present scene to set off the flashback. Indicate the transition using past perfect tense, then switch to simple past once you've oriented the readers within the flashback, and finally exit the scene by repeating the process in reverse. Use a familiar detail from the present scene to reorient readers and anchor them back into it. Or, as Burroway suggests, there's nothing wrong with simply transitioning back to the present with the word "now." Along with the ways of manipulating fictional time we've mentioned already, there's one final technique: slow motion. Slow-mo can be used to highlight significant details or convey a sense of intense focus in a way that mirrors a real phenomenon. We've all had that feeling of time slowing during a moment of emotional intensity. We noticed every little tick on someone's face while breaking bad news to them. The whole world seemed to slow down moments before a wreck. A peculiar detail can dilate time so that a glance feels like we've been staring and analyzing for hours. To create this sense of slow-mo in fiction, we simply take our time describing scene details and the character's subsequent thoughts. We can further heighten that sense of hyperfocus by including random details the POV characters can't help noticing in the background of this emotionally intense scene. Often beginning writers neglect the dramatic potential of their setting. They choose a place, time, and mood they find compelling or familiar, whether or not those elements are significant to the character and her journey. But what we want is a setting that heightens conflict and creates emotional, symbolic, or thematic resonance. Rendering every moment in scene and using slow-mo to zoom in on every detail indiscriminately doesn't lead to immersiveness, but glut. Likewise, when we render turning points in summary or skip over them altogether using white space, only hinting at key moments from the past, it leads not to concision but dearth. By understanding all the techniques for creating and conveying fictional setting at our disposal, we make sure the setting does multiple things at once. If where and when you live is what shapes you every moment of your life, it also informs every major decision you make. So while fictional setting may be the story's background, it is a foreground concern.